Welcome everyone to today's webinar, Reimagining Your Healthcare Supply Chain, Why Wait for the Next Crisis? The key strategies for driving transparency and process excellence during any crisis. I am Brian Zimmerman with Becker's Hospital Review. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation, and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into the Q&A box you see on your screen. We're looking forward to hearing your questions. Today's session is being recorded and will be available after the event. You can use the same link you used to log into today's webinar to access the recording. And at this time, I'm pleased to turn the floor over to Daniel to begin today's presentation.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. It's a pleasure to be here with my esteemed colleagues and presenters. We're going to talk about supply chain today, and as many of you on the phone are aware, supply chain has been at the top of the list of many hospital executives and leaders for quite some time. COVID has put the healthcare system and all of us in a set of many different challenges, and none that we take lightly. And the title of today is Why Wait for the Next Crisis? And unfortunately, I think we're still very much in that crisis as a healthcare organizations and healthcare delivery systems, and as a country as it relates to healthcare. And so we wanted to bring new insights and expertise to that discussion today. So I'm really proud to introduce the presenters. And I'm going to start off with Jim Churchman, who currently serves as the Vice President of System Supply Chain for MedStar Health, Inc. In Columbia, Maryland, with locations in Baltimore, Washington, D.C., and Southern Maryland. He has over 30 years of executive leadership experience in supply chain, manufacturing, distribution, logistics, and finance, with primary practice areas centering on strategic sourcing, operations management, continuous improvement, and lean methodologies. And as you'll hear from Jim, he brings expertise outside of healthcare. He's been in the automotive industry, the telecom industry, the high-tech industry, and so lots of learnings that he's also brought from other industries, and we'll gain from that insight today. It's my pleasure to introduce Todd Plesko, who's a nationally known expert on the topic of healthcare supply chain optimization, currently the CEO of SIFT, an AI-enhanced inventory control and end-to-end supply chain management solution for hospitals and health systems. He previously founded and served in the leadership roles at several healthcare technology companies, including TriPractice, Extension Healthcare, and Vocera Communications. Todd, welcome. Lee Smith has more than 35 years of experience in healthcare, including 19 years in supply chain and information technology. She has held leadership positions in hospitals as well as other healthcare organizations such as Cardinal Health, CareFusion, and BD. As the Director for Nursing Informatics at SIFT, Lee oversees point-of-use and analytics solutions that help to drive efficiencies and expense reductions throughout the perioperative environment. Welcome, and really happy to have you.
Thank you.
And so, with that, I'd love to begin the discussion. As I said, if you look at data across the industry, we know that workforce is always the top of the expense line, and people are irreplaceable in healthcare. And when you look further down the line of investments and expenses that hospitals and health systems make, you'll see supply chain. And supply chain has done wonders, but it also has lots of areas of improvement. I think we've seen some of that, obviously, with the COVID crisis. So we're going to kick off with our panelists with some broad questions, and then we're happy to take questions as we go through. So I'll start off with the concept of optimizing the supply chain and setting the stage. I'm wondering if each of you could share your perspectives on where healthcare supply chain management stands compared to other industries. And Jim, I'm going to throw that over to you because, as I described, you bring multiple industry perspective to this concept.
Thanks, Dan. Appreciate you moderating here today. From my vantage point, supply chain really does lag other industries, particularly those around manufacturing and retail. The need to modernize and advance has really never been more prevalent, no more of a burning platform than we have at this time. I think the pandemic has really accentuated that need, but it clearly isn't the only reason for that need. And I remember when I first joined healthcare, I used to remark to people that our technology that we used in many instances was like that of a sundial and an abacus, very, very outdated, very lack of technology. And I've often likened healthcare as driving a car through the rearview mirror. A lot of times our data comes in arrears 5 to 6 weeks after the fact, and it just accentuates the challenges that a pandemic brings to the forefront.
Great. Todd, how about you sharing some thoughts on where we are compared to other industries?
Sure. Thanks, Dan, and thanks to everyone joining today. We know that you're busy and you have plenty to do, especially in this day and age, historic times, exciting, anxiety-inducing, emotional times in healthcare. But with it comes an opportunity, certainly, to have discussions like this, and an opportunity for all of us that are in the space to have the spotlight shown on us for some period of time, where the universe has decided that we are, one of the most important things right now, if not the most important thing in U.S. healthcare because of COVID. So it is up to us, it's incumbent upon us to take advantage of the opportunity. To answer the question, I like to drive to sort of the root, the macroeconomic conditions or the technical conditions upon why we are behind. I agree with Jim entirely. This industry lags as it relates to supply chain. There are two reasons I like to articulate when I'm discussing with the market or with customers. One lies in the core systems. So in today's day and age, obviously you have the ERP and you have the EHR. The EHR is a verticalized solution. It's designed for healthcare. It's designed for hospitals, if we're talking about hospital supply chain, whereas the ERP is not. So you're taking a horizontal solution and leveraging it, a very massive core system that covers many personas, many users inside of a healthcare system, and sort of force feeding it into this hospital environment. Secondly, because of ERPs not fitting the mold of healthcare, they're ripe for customizations. And over the last 30 years, as many of you on the call know, many of these solutions have been customized. There have been add-on point solutions. Apps made it even more so. I'll give you a quick story. One of our enterprise customers, an academic medical center, large one in the Midwest, very prestigious. I was meeting with the CIO, and he had said, we have 1,300 apps here, and our goal is to get it to 900. And 1,300 apps, that is certainly a lot. So the drive to contract from expanding applications, some of which or many of which derive from supply chain, because we're dealing with this horizontal solution of the ERP, has given rise to customization, an army of systems integrators or consultants, many may be on the call, and it seems like we're starting to contract from that for many reasons. If you think about a hospital or a healthcare system, the layperson will think of it in terms of care delivery, but it's so much more. It's all of a restaurant, it's all of a hotel, in layman's terms again, even retail with gift shops and more, in pharmacies, et cetera. It is a massive supply chain endeavor requiring massive supply chain solutions. What's important to me is that the solution fit the need, and this is why in healthcare, where I've spent my career, healthcare-specific solutions seem to rise toward the top. In the horizontal solutions, seem to struggle a bit. Now, in the case of ERPs, there are no alternatives for the most part. They satisfy lots of industries. But I think those are two key reasons why you're dealing with a major piece of software that is horizontal, and to cover for that, you've created this cottage industry of applications and systems integrators and consultants to mask the deficiencies. And I think, Dan, what we're arriving at is a new day and age and a new opportunity to remedy some of that.
Yeah, that's very helpful, Todd, your horizontal comparison in that cottage industry. Lee, you're deeply experienced in this field and have seen this from a number of different angles and companies. Can you share some of your perspective on why supply chain might have been placed on the back burner as opposed to the forefront, where we're feeling it more today?
Sure. When you look at all the research that's been done, even in our own industry, about 89% of all hospital and supply chain executives feel that the healthcare supply chain lags behind all other industries. And it's because of a lot of things. There's resource limitations, there's competing priorities, patient safety needs, need to increase service line profitability, and cost reduction initiatives that have been ongoing. So investments in supply chain have been pushed to the back burner. With this pandemic, we've realized that in order to have an effective supply chain that can address patient needs and protect the patient, we need to have a process in place that can look at demand, and demand in the future, not demand right now. I take it back to looking at managing ORs my whole career, and knowing that, the impossible happens when you need a product. It's not there for the patient on the day of surgery, or when you're picking the case for tomorrow, you're going to have a delay or a cancellation. It's not because somebody didn't know that we needed that product. It's that we didn't know we needed it in that volume because we didn't have predictive demand forecasting. So with SIFT, we can look at predictive demand forecasting 2 months down the line and tell me what I need to order so I know it's available for my patients. And that's the type of systems that we need in healthcare that can look at the unanticipated and the future rather than the immediate and reactive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's sort of, Jim, the analogy of driving through the rearview mirror. We of course, are here in large part because supply chain has been rising in interest, but COVID has laid bare some of the very significant challenges of our entire system. And I really believe this is an industry issue. I don't really believe that any one particular hospital or leader wakes up and says, I don't want to be the best at what I'm doing. There's some really, as Todd pointed out, some structural challenges to this. But Jim, before we get into the discussion about how COVID has maybe changed some of what you've done in the face of this crisis, I'm curious, if we wound back the clock 3 months ago, where would you place supply chain and some of the challenges you faced? And the second part of that question is, and then what has COVID done to accelerate either the opportunity or the challenges? I'd like to just go back a few months and imagine we were having this same conversation, and then lay COVID on top of that.
If you really start with our core mission, which is the sustainment of patient care, and then you focus on what Lee stated, which is absolutely right, that historically we haven't had this predictive forecasting with strong demand signals, which means that our ability to be forward-looking and predict, whether it's through cyclical occurrences, seasonality, whatever that may be, rather complicates the situation. And then when COVID appears, the challenges that we're faced with is, first and foremost, trying to keep a sustainable supply at that point of care, and trying to do it when we're procuring out of channel, which is very challenging. And then coupled with that, the need to really have this accelerated evidence-based protocol with clinical teams that allows us to bring atypical partners or atypical products into the mix and be able to gain their approval from a clinical acceptability point of view. And then really trying to foster supply sustainment in an environment when the end state is still, for the most part, conjecture. So all those variables come into the mix here that makes, from a supply chain perspective, a very complicated situation. But once again, really accentuates what Lee talked about and the need that we've got to be able to have this analytical presence, which to varying degrees, we're still not there.
Yeah. Todd, I'm curious, SIFT and you and your team see organizations throughout the country. And are some of the challenges that Jim described similar to what you're seeing from your other partners and organizations that you speak to?
Of course. And, MedStar happens be a very, very good healthcare system. I'm not just saying that because Jim's on the call. I'm saying it because it's actually quite true from leadership on down, passionate about improving, in this case, supply chain. And we do see that across, many of our customers. Not all of them bring the same level of passion, but we're in a good spot to see, Dan. SIFT is a bit of an enigma. We service just under 1,000 U.S. hospitals today, 970, 980 hospitals. So we have a good view into the leadership teams, what drives them, what the strategic plans are, and very the vision, the intent, but very specifically where the investment is going. Is it going into, point solutions or Band-Aids? We have a problem here, solve it with a solution, or is it more of an enterprise, long-term, thinking approach? And that's what we traditionally see, what I would call the good hospital systems doing, is taking a very thoughtful, deliberate, multi-departmental approach to solving what is really a multi-departmental problem, to bring supply chain into the modern age and pick a platform that doesn't only solve the problems we know about today. Everyone on this call knows about many of the supply chain problems that hospitals face today, but problems that we may not even know about today. A platform that can grow with you. So my message to the market is a bit of buyer beware, and also to emulate some of these good hospital systems and take this very thoughtful approach. I'll give you a quick story. I report to a board, as many of us do, and they ask what's in store for smaller software companies, post-COVID. And because I have a deep background in startups, I give a very candid response, which is there are a few things I wouldn't want to be today. One, I mentioned earlier, a non-vertical solution in healthcare may be persona non grata, going forward, especially the smaller software applications. A point solution, a solution that is designed to solve one particular problem. In the 90s, we called them best-of-breed solutions. It is very much an enterprise buying market, not just for standardization and vendor reduction, but really, truly for value add, for solving problems beyond what's in our immediate purview. Software companies that have the required services to support their solution that are based, in the United States. I know that may be a bit of an aggressive statement, but what we're seeing, very clearly, is a movement, regardless of what happens in November. I think that there is a common appetite to drive more and more manufacturing and solution development here in the United States. For better or worse, we're seeing that. And, we'll see some companies benefit and some companies not. Lastly, the right size. You have to find the right partner, would be my advice to the group. And again, this is where the good hospital systems take their time and they deliberate and ensure that they're picking the right one. We're seeing small companies struggle, whereas traditionally they may have had great investment money, great idea, very, very talented people. They're going to struggle more than previous times to penetrate the U.S. healthcare market. It's just going to be very, very difficult. If you're a capital model, it's going to be very, very difficult to drive big budgets before the hospital system begins to see returns. So an operationalized or SaaS model is very, very important. So all of those things, to me, epitomize the way MedStar is approaching things from a strategic vision approach, selecting, an appropriate vendor, and having the vision to solve more problems than what's directly in front of the purview.
Great. Jim, in leading up to this call, we had some really interesting discussions about the role of supply chain in the organization and how supply chain thinks about itself and how supply chain leaders communicate with physicians. And you gave some really interesting analogies around physicians reading data all day, right? And having scientific data come back to them. And then the need to have that same kind of intelligence to be able to communicate with physicians who are A, bright, and B, competitive. So I'm curious how, as a supply chain executive and leader, you think that that folks in your seat can work the most effectively with their clinician partners?
It's an interesting question, Dan. I've kind of always looked at it this way, that if you think about a patient that's in a critical situation laying on the table in the ED, a team of physicians will come in, they'll quickly discern through analytical data, and they'll make a prognosis and a diagnosis for the patient. But then when we get into the back office environment, we become much less predictive, much less analytical, much more elongated. And so my view has always been that when we interact from a supply chain perspective with those physicians, we have to take the form of what I call a technocrat. I view the modern day supply chain in healthcare as really being akin to the quarterback on the field. We see all the different business lanes. We have the opportunity to see all the usage, the spend data. We see where we have supplier partner A that might be operating in cardiology, but also in another area within the organization. So our job to the physician team is to bring all that data to bear and do it in a very succinct, efficient, and actionable manner. I view supply chain's role in that physician relationship as to bring options to the table, not to necessarily be edicting a solution, but to be able to bring to them data that's analytically and fact-based. I've always found that the physician teams then really are able to discern that data quickly, like they do in their own point-of-care environments, and make good decisions for the organization. I think COVID has amplified that. And so being able to have real-time analytics, being able to have point-of-use applications that can provide that data on a real-time basis in an actionable manner is really the vision and the direction that supply chain needs to move to.
Yeah, and Jim, you said one of your department chairs or chiefs leads off a meeting. I think these are 6 o'clock meetings. You're getting in there early, and he looks at you and he says, "Jim," and they said it couldn't be done. Can you tell us a little bit about what that meant and what transformed in the culture you're building?
It was really this combination of the need for the organization to have cost efficiencies, to be able to have a more manageable environment from a clinical value analysis perspective and advancement of quality care. And it came within our spinal implementation area where we had just a significant number of providers that we had historically used. And we came together with the physician team, much as I described in this very kind of fact-based technical type discussion, where we talked about benchmarking, we talked about where we compared to other IDNs, and we had this vision of consolidation. And it was a rather aggressive one, to the point where, there were many that were disbelievers about that, but being able to bring that kind of data to the physician team and to be able to connect the dots for them as to what that would mean, not only from their clinical care point of view, but then from an economic value proposition. And this team of a large group of physicians, we came together for a large volume of spend and embarked upon this mission that many from the inception said it couldn't be done, meaning that we couldn't be successful as a team and be able to drive this rather significant change management across a lot of type A physicians and be able to drive consensus. But we were able to. And it continues to be a work in progress. So that chief surgeon typically starts our meetings with that phrase, which usually elicits a chuckle from a lot of the folks in the room, but it's also behind the scenes a reminder that, we said from the inception that signing a contractual agreement is really the easy part. It's getting to that compliance and that advancement and that marching up the maturity curve that then becomes the difficult piece. And I think whether we're talking about COVID or whether we're talking about business as usual, being able to bring these analytical platforms and point of use inventory systems to bear really is just another piece of that puzzle.
Mm-hmm. And Jim, MedStar undertook some changes to optimize this supply chain, and I think independently you and Todd and the team and Lee have talked about this concept of dock to dock, right? And so can you talk a little bit about that and what some of those changes are to improve the supply chain that you're making?
I think the mission that MedStar has been on is really not unlike what my peers across healthcare have been doing. And we learn a lot from that collaboration with the other IDNs and sharing of best practices. And that's helped shape our journey from the inception. I believe at the end of the day, with many things that we do in life, it comes down to people, process, and then really passion. And my belief is that a supply chain really has and is called to deliver upon three core value streams. First and foremost is how is it that we improve patient safety and quality of outcome at the patient bedside? Number one, very important. Number two, then, is the maximization of the economic value across the enterprise. And some people will just say that, the reduction of operating expense and how do we become more lean. And then the third is really that cash preservation. And I have really used the term that from a supply chain perspective, we are called to serve from the dock to the dock, meaning from the time those supplies hit our institution all the way through the physician experience. So as we've worked to optimize, it's this focus on bringing technological tools to the forefront to help us, bringing the advent of real-time analytics that we can share succinctly with our physician and our clinical teams. Certainly embarking upon standardization. We hear the term systemness a lot, and what does that really mean? Standardization is a big key that we can really coalesce through value analysis around what is it we're going to use on our patients, consolidating those key supplier relationships so we can be more focused with those key partners, and that helps really strengthen our clinical partnership and try and make sure that they have the tools and everything that they need in order to provide what they do to the patient bedside. And a lot of that starts with data. We've got to come armed to the equation with data and deep analytics.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
Hey, Dan, do you mind if I jump in and just make a comment or two on that? That was great. I wanted to comment on the doc-to-doc. We liked it so much that we actually trademarked that. So, Dan, you owe us $1. You owe it to Whitney St. Pierre. I'm sort of tongue-in-cheek there. The reason I wanted to mention it is when we think of doc-to-doc, one of the reasons we liked it so much from a terminology standpoint is, it does involve the doctor, and this is where all this data ultimately ends up. We talk about it all the time, the fidelity of data and the requirement for pristine data that a doctor, a physician, a surgeon, as a scientist can pressure test and interpret, and it's very, very important, the fidelity component of that. When we say doc-to-doc, it means a couple of things. One, it means a holistic workflow of supply chain, and that's, that is exactly our approach. And we believe that to provide that visibility, those actionable insights to a surgeon, that you actually need that doc-to-doc visibility. We've met with distributors and GPOs and many others where they lose visibility at certain points. For instance, a pack or a kit, you lose visibility when it arrives at the case cart. It's difficult to ascertain exactly how much was used from that point thereafter. So when we say doc-to-doc, we mean holistic. It is a holistic workflow of supply chain management all the way through consumption with the associated high-fidelity, pristine analytics. And that's very, very important. One other quick comment. We mentioned a moment ago, Jim was talking about ROI, or an economic value model. I'd made mention on the last question, companies that could struggle, and I would add that to the list. Companies without a realistic, bona fide economic value model, or an ROI, for simple terms. Everybody has the marketing fluff, the PowerPoints and the PDF, but we're talking about real, true, bona fide ROI that can be pressure tested and proven either against other clients or customized into an environment. And we don't see a lot of that in our space. What we tend to see is a lot of marketing documents. So I just wanted to comment on both those things. I love the doc-to-doc nomenclature, primarily because it represents this holistic view. So, Jim, thank you, and thanks for letting me chime in.
Yeah, thank you. Jim, as you guys are in the supply chain business, preparedness has taken on a whole new meaning for every ounce and inch of our life. But it's something hospitals have always had to deal with, right? Disruptions happen, there's backup systems, hospitals can't go down, so to speak. And as you think about future disruptions, how does optimizing supply chain fit into that discussion? And is that at a heightened level these days?
Yeah, I think it is at a heightened level. And one of the things I worry about with COVID is that we can't forget about what we've been going through. We can't, once we get through it, just move on to the next thing. We've got to become stronger and more resilient as a result of it. It was interesting. I was reading an article not too long ago about the benefits of forest fires, and while they can be tragic, that in many times now for the management of large forests, they induce those automatically, and they call it fire regime. And they say that from peril comes progress. And that impressed upon me because I think as we go through these types of situations, COVID being one example, any kind of disruption that we experience, it causes us to think outside of our norm. It causes us to reinvent ourselves and figure out how we've got to become stronger and more predictable. So as we've gone through COVID, just really having a heightened focus on usage velocity and being able to translate that into different opportunities for standardization that we've seen where we thought maybe we were more standardized than what we actually are, and seeing maybe a diverse use of different types of products that we can consolidate down even more. Have just been reminders of the opportunities that we have, and I think it's these kinds of disruptions that are going to make us stronger. Being able to really understand our pandemic preparedness or our emergency preparedness from a days on hand. And this disruption has really thrown some of those paradigms out the window as to what would our standards be going forward. And so I think anytime that we can go through those types of situations, we're going to emerge on the other end better prepared going forward.
Yeah, that's very helpful. Lee, as people are stepping back and thinking about what they can do, as many of us have had to adjust to a new reality, and certainly the folks in healthcare have been on the front lines of this, you start to ask yourself, what are some of the first steps that I might be able to take with this new lens? What are some of the first things they can do to optimize supply chain practices as supply chain has become more important than ever?
So Todd mentioned dock-to-dock solutions, and Jim also mentioned the visibility of supplies in the departments. We've heard from customers that once they brought product in, they lost visibility in the department level. So they didn't know if they had adequate PPE in one department, if they could move it to another department. So I think that, hospitals need to look at adopting software that can automate this really complex supply chain that has multiple handoffs, from the dock to receiving to distribution to usage. It has lots of handoffs. And also we saw during the pandemic, there are outside influences beside the distributor. We have federal and local agencies that were inside the supply chain that we had to collaborate with. So having software that you can deploy in all of your areas in different forms will help it. Plus, we see patients' pathways vary a great deal. We have patients that come in through the ED. They may go to the ICU. They may go to a nursing unit. And as we saw in the pandemic, not all of those patients survived, unfortunately. SIFT has taken the step to look at a unique software that tracks decedents in a compassionate and efficient way that complies with both the hospital's management and what they require, as well as the state and hospital. And that's an important concept when you're in a surge or a crisis where you have a number of casualties and deaths, to be able to automate that process, ensure that those patients are moving through. We only have a limited number of spaces for those patients. So it's not just one part you have to automate. You have to automate the entire process, making sure that it's easy for the clinicians, easy for the supply chain, and you're still getting all that data we need.
Mm-hmm. Very helpful. How about you, Todd? What are some of the steps that people can look to take?
Well, I have to completely change my answer because I was going to use my decedent management story for this one, but clearly Lee took that from me. I didn't. I should have coordinated better. No, I agree with everything Lee said. Here's my response to that. First, the best customers that we see are the ones that have some level of vision or guiding principle upon which they're trying to succeed. So we actually have a large enterprise customer. They began the project years ago with the concept of, Todd, these are our guiding principles for this project. Jim made mention of that with his chief surgeon a moment ago. Those are the best customers because they have a vision of what they're trying to achieve, maybe not now and maybe not through the deliverable process, but long term. And that's what we're seeing here. When we say words like holistic and lots of personas, and Lee had made mention to automate every aspect of supply chain, dock to dock, whatever term you wish to use, picking the right solution and vendor is very, very important. So you have to begin with some level of vision. What problem are you trying to solve? And I think most hospital systems, when they really look at it, and they realize that there are many areas of supply chain that are ripe for improvement. So the list grows and grows and grows, and it all leads to the same place, which is choose an enterprise vendor that can solve these immediate problems that deliver value or check boxes or solve real problems soon, not a year, 18 months, or 24 months down the road, but yet you have a vision and a plan to either utilize more of the services or utilize more of the solutions over time such that you can solve more problems over time. So here's where I'll go into my decedent management story. We have a large customer in St. Louis. They've been using our warehouse and distribution software solutions for many years. And they had an issue in the morgue, and they wanted to automate it. And they reached out to us. We co-developed the solution. It's part of our platform. We call it decedent management now. It's fascinating because this is clearly customer-driven. It's clearly a need, and what we're finding now in our sales outreach is it's just under 100% of the time that we bring up our decedent management solution, we receive a very favorable response, which is, we have that problem too, and we've always had that problem. Managing the logistics inside of the morgue and dealing with outside entities is a challenge, and there's not a solution ripe to solve it. So for us, from an enterprise perspective, that was a solution that we wanted to solve once we realized how significant of a problem it was. And it's a great example of a software platform or a services-enabled technology platform solving problems we don't even know about today that is there for the taking, such that you can solve problems deep into the future. Very, very proud of what we're doing there because it's a perfect example of a hospital system trying to work with an existing vendor that they like and to solve future problems. And when they had originally reached out, they didn't think in any way, shape, or form we would have a solution. And once our products team dove into it, it was a very, very nice fit. And now that our sales team is selling it downstream into the market, we're realizing just how big of a problem it is really nearly in every single hospital and how it's a perfect bolt-on to an inventory management enterprise solution. So very exciting. So first step, find out what you wish to do, develop your vision or your guiding principles, and as always, be sure to be deliberate with intent as you begin to select a vendor.
Jim, we talked a little bit about the leadership and the role. Some of that responsibility certainly falls on the shoulders of executives that are in your position. And we've seen in the last 5 to 7 years roles like Chief Experience Officer, Chief Patient Officer. What's your perspective on where supply chain sits, so to speak, if I hate to say this, in the hierarchy? Has it changed? Do folks in your seat need to do more to be more vocal about the level of importance? Do we need other executives to maybe see this challenge through different lenses as we move forward to enhance this industry, this part of the industry?
I think certainly supply chain has become here over the past 5 years and continues to become in healthcare a much more prominent strategic partner. Historically, supply chain in healthcare was referred to a term that I don't care for called materials management, which really elicits a whole different thought of really transactional type activities. But in today's world, with the advent of the chief procurement officer, chief supply chain officer, it really does indicate this elevation of the strategic contribution to the overall organization. So the chief experience officer, things of that role ultimately go down to what is that patient experience? What is that quality of outcome? And really that's our mission. So supply chain's got to be subservient to that, has to be a strong contributor to that, and has got to be a strategic voice at the table, particularly when you started off this session talking about how the number one expense within healthcare is labor, and that's factual. But then when you go and you look at what's typically number two, it's the supply expense. And so when we're looking to really influence the efficiency of healthcare, what's the next area that we're going to go after? And it's that supply expense. And our ability to really manage that and optimize and progress that certainly comes with the ability to have data readily at our fingertips. It requires us to do things differently. Clearly, this COVID has accentuated to all of us the need for diversification and to be able to see much further past just our distribution partner. So I think it's supply chain today is really being able to have that full continuum strategy to bring to the organization.
Dan, can I add to that real quick, if I may? Here's I guess it's a passionate call to action to the group today. I see a tremendous opportunity, and frankly, this book has been written. When I started in this space in healthcare technology in the 90s, quite literally, IT was in the basement, and there was an opportunity. In my experience, it was the Y2K issue where IT came to the forefront, and they became more and more strategic, from the basement to the boardroom, and it worked. And obviously, fast forward to today, IT, the role of the CTO and CIO, CMIO, CNIO. Tremendously strategic, tremendously value add, and tremendously important. When COVID really began to have the impact in February and March, and we began to study and to see that supply chain technologies was coming more and more into the forefront. Clearly, an underlying theme throughout this whole thing was U.S. supply chain. I started to think about the 90s and Y2K and what that did for not only the role of the CIO, but just IT in general. So what I see is a tremendous opportunity for everyone on this call to step into the spotlight a bit and to command more strategic attention, whether it be budgets or projects or whatnot, because indeed, and my team has heard me say this before, if it sounds rehearsed, it's because I've said it before, the universe has decided that for the time being we are the most important thing. And it's incumbent upon us to take advantage of the opportunity to improve.
Mm-hmm. And along those lines, how should hospitals prepare differently and ensure they're more prepared for future pandemics? And Lee, I'll kick that over to you.
Sure. So it's not anticipating a second surge. I mean, there's going to be other events. I mean, they're predicting this is going to be one of our worst hurricane seasons. So up and down the East Coast, hospitals need to be preparing for what happens if we have a catastrophic hurricane in our area. So creating not only an effective and adequate contingency plan, but one that looks at a whole host of scenarios, whether it be a natural disaster or a pandemic that may have significant supply disruptions. That's the first thing that they need to do. You need to be able to include other aspects other than the supply chain. What if I have to stand up a new off-site building? What if I have to stand up an auxiliary hospital in a tent somewhere? How will Jim manage that supplies over there? What will he leverage? So SIFT has the technology to help, not only the technology, but the labor to help hospitals both in a surge and in an anticipated crisis to stand up facilities, to ensure that your inventory is correct, to label, to build. All those things need to be considered when you're looking at contingency planning. It can't be a single facet. It needs to look at the what if scenarios, because And the pandemic has showed there were lots of what ifs that happened.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very helpful. How about you, Todd, from that perspective? What preparing differently, being prepared for future pandemics?
Sure. I'd echo what Lee had said. Jim had mentioned demand forecasting earlier. We're in a new era of demand forecasting with machine learning and AI. It's better. We're not just looking at cyclical or seasonality or trends based on what happened last year. We are looking at customer input that can forecast or model what might be needed. It's an exciting time in that regard. The technology is caught up to the need. It's not terribly expensive. The data inputs and the feeds are available. And to deliver that level of actionable analytics, it doesn't cost a fortune, and it's not terribly difficult to get up and running, especially if you want baseline visibility. Again, it comes down to picking the right partner. What I find fascinating, the second component to that is a thought change that seems to be happening after COVID. I'll give you a quick example. We have a West Coast customer that has been using our point of use solution long enough to realize that there's literally a 40% return rate from the case card. And of course, there are certain surgeons that are bigger offenders. But now the thinking has changed from, Dr. Todd, he's sort of always been that way, and we just, we put up with it because it's Dr. Todd, to that 40% is actually taking OR core space from something else that might be more meaningful for the next disruption or the next surge. That level of consciousness is changing, and it's a fantastic thing, in my opinion, where we see more accountability and more drive for true change in preparation for the next disruption or surge, which I think is quite wonderful and will certainly deliver the industry forward.
Yeah, fascinating component around how we might look at that 40% differently today than we had just several months ago. Jim, before we get over into some of the Q&A, can you share some guidance to the audience about how this change management process works in MedStar and how you've really gone about building a coalition of voices to help move this agenda forward?
Yeah, I think one of the things that continues to impress me is that it's got to be a collaborative, and just always amazed at the bright minds that really are around me from a multitude of different disciplines. And as I think back on what are our key strategies going forward and what do those need to encapsulate, first and foremost is just continue to plan for likely scenarios with key collaborators across the system. And what is it that we're going to do to constantly be ready and to continue to recognize the risks associated with our current supply chain practices? I think part of that then is, as we've worked as a team, it's been to try and understand what are some of those points of failure, where are those partner relationships that maybe provide additional risk into the organization that we really want to overcome. And then working with partners to try and understand what are the broadened levels of metrics that we want to use as an organization that really describes the supply chain performance and how that translates down to the point of patient care. So those are some of the areas that we've been focused on.
Yeah, that's really helpful. Before I hop into the questions, there's some helpful resources that you'll get as part of this follow-up on the slide here. And we can just show those some really nice links and support assets that you can use in your journey. So I'm going to take some of these questions that we've gotten. I'm the director of supply chain at my hospital. I've had a lot of resistance from leadership regarding making investments to supply chain. What's your advice?
Would you like me to take that, Dan?
Yeah, sure. Todd and Jim. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll be quick, Jim. I already said it. I believe this is the opportunity. This is it right here. This is, as I mentioned earlier, Y2K for IT. It's a historic opportunity where the universe has decided we're clearly the most important thing, and it it's a call to action. It behooves us to drive meaningful change right now. I've discussed openly and publicly that, I'd like to see our policymakers really focus on U.S. healthcare supply chain. I'd love to see our version of meaningful use where, investment is freed up to help you to deliver that meaningful change. So my best advice is to be bold. If ever there were a time to be bold, it's right now. It's on the tip of everyone's minds, on the tip of everyone's tongues, to make sure that we have a hardened supply chain. That clearly begins with understanding and having visibility into what you're doing, understanding that data. And I'm sure Jim will probably mention this, but taking a multi-departmental approach often seems to work. Everywhere that I've been in my career, just focusing on one area in your silo, often will get you a bit of the stiff arm. If you bring in clinical, if you bring in IT, if you bring in finance, and you have a meaningful economic value model, that can make all of the difference. But I'll end with this portion of my comments. It's a fleeting moment. We will not be number one or number two. It's fascinating looking at the data today. Virtual care, supply chain automation, analytics, and technology. Number one or number two. Above reimbursements. When has that ever happened? Obviously, over time, that'll reshuffle a bit. So now is the opportunity. Now is the opportunity to grab the moment and drive meaningful change in your organization. And, of course, we're happy to help in any way that we can. Jim?
Yeah, Todd, I think you touched upon a lot of it, but the question's a valid one. It's one that I've always struggled with. I've always been amazed at the magnitude of capital requests that come into a large healthcare organization or even a smaller one versus the allowable budget. And so from a supply chain perspective, I always feel a bit reticent about trying to get in line and take some of that money when most typically it's earmarked for initiatives that are directly at the point of care. So I think it becomes challenging, and it resonates with me. If I go back to the three core tenets, though, that I believe supply chain is really called to embody, first and foremost is how does it directly contribute to that safe patient care environment, that quality of outcome? I think that's got to be number one, and I'll come back to that in just a second. Number two is what's the economic value that it'll drive for the organization in a sustainable way? And three, how does it help really subsidize or enhance the cash position of the organization? But all those things being said, I ultimately believe, back to Todd's point, that there's got to be that clinical endorsement, that you have to go to those clinical stakeholders and you have to be able to articulate the value proposition. They need to be able to understand it. They need to be able to endorse it and say, hey, this really will help patient care. This will serve as risk mitigation at the bedside. Won't happen in all instances, but I think more times than not, you could surprise yourself and see that could be a pathway.
Mm-hmm. Lee, I have a question for you. I keep telling people never in my life would I have ever imagined that a hospital or a health system might be in a similar position from a pizza shop. And what do I mean by that? I couldn't have imagined a world where COVID would equally close a dining facility and a hospital facility. It just wasn't on, I think, any of our radars. And so when we think about expired products and supplies, that's generally an issue. But we're coming back, hopefully getting back online. But then I see, in Texas, they're rolling back some of their surgeries, right, because the spread of the virus. And you have this issue, and we've been talking about systemness and visibility, but now this expired product takes on even a new lens in a world where, these ASCs and operating centers were literally laying unused. So what are your thoughts on expired products and supplies, and what are the first steps that people can take to address this, as this problem might be more present than even before?
Well, first and foremost, technology really assists with that, being able to document lot number, serial number, being able to capture things such as expiration dates, and having technology that can alert you to when you have inventory that's approaching expiration, either at the 90, 60, 30-day mark. But I also think it's really changing the clinical paradigms. And I'll give you a little bit of a story in the past where we were trying to get the clinical teams to really see the value in it. And, they were focused on patient care, and we were trying to drive the impetus to that. We ended up coming up with what we called, and it was somewhat of an internal marketing campaign, the nurseometer. And we were trying to say that every day was amnesty day. If the clinical teams found expired product, we wanted them to place it in a bin so we could simply run analytics on it, try and understand what the causal factors are. And we turned it into the nurseometer that said for every roughly $80,000 of expired product that we found, we saved a nursing position. And we were able to draw those analytics and put graphics to it that really kind of captured everybody's attention. But then, really trying to keep it more real. If you think about sitting in a waiting room with a family member in a critical procedure, and the physician were to come out and say, hey, everything went well, but we discovered that we implanted some expired product on your family member, we'd be horrified at that. So I think trying to always be mindful and keep it real and draw those correlations is also very helpful, at least I've found helpful in the past, to try and raise that to prominence.
Mm-hmm. Lee, I know this is an area you have a lot of experience in. Any thoughts for this question about how do you deal with expired supplies and products?
So you're absolutely right. I mean, ORs and ambulatory surgery centers have been shut down for quite a while, and they've been converted into ICUs, and items have been moved around. You don't really know what products may or may not have been expired, and if you don't have any software. And to Jim's point, it's horrible, and it's a real problem if you've implanted an expired product into a patient. And I have not personally experienced it, but I've had friends and colleagues who have had that happen, and it is devastating. So being able to have not only the technology to look and see, but also maybe having an inventory service like we have that will come in and take a look at your products and look at your expired and pull them so that you don't have that situation. Most ORs have anywhere from 12 to 24,000 line items. That's a lot of line items to have expired products in. And no way can you just do it, through a couple people. You need a team.
Yeah, thank you very much. This is a question I think a lot of people are wondering, but someone says one of our biggest concerns about changing our supply chain management practices is getting the physicians engaged. Jim, I know we talked about this, but this is not an easy topic. Did you have challenges with this? I know you talked about and we said it couldn't be done, but that's probably not where you started. What advice can you give to the audience on this piece, Jim?
Well, my experience has been that it really is befitting of constant communication. The relationship with the clinical and the physician team is one that just has to endure on a consistent basis and just always to remain connected. And I think when you do that, you develop those deep relationships and you have the opportunity to really drive change. And I've found that to be successful. As we've worked on compliance, one of the things that we've recognized, and we've tried to study this just across healthcare, is that when these PPI type agreements get signed, we have the moment of jubilation, but then the supply chain and the physicians typically don't come back together in many instances until it's time for a renewal or the expiration date is approaching. And so we've tried to focus on just remaining connected with data, with talking about clinical needs and such, and do it on such a frequency that relationship becomes more enduring, and it's not just
Yeah. Todd, I think I'm going to do one last question here. Similar vein, how do you get clinicians' involvement in point of use solutions? This is another audience question about that involvement in the clinician.
Sure. It probably sounds harder than it really is. A, show them the value, and B, show them a high fidelity of data that's unimpeachable. And this is where historically I think the industry has gone wrong, and frankly exactly why we built the company the way that we built. If you think about the data chain, if you will, ultimately this all ends up in a room with value analysis, informatics, finance, whomever, talking to Dr. Todd about why he is more expensive than Dr. Jim or Dr. Average Cost. And Dr. Todd in this example, or any physician, they are scientists. They are skilled and trained in the scientific method. They understand statistics and data very, very well, but they're also people, and they don't want to be Dr. High Cost. They don't want to spend more money or take more time to deliver a good outcome than any of their other colleague surgeons. So unimpeachable data from doc to doc, if you will. In this specific example, from the item master to the loading dock, to the point of use. Unimpeachable data. There's two flavors of point of use. The simple, where we can look and compare and contrast or benchmark, surgeon cost economics. And the complex, which is to actually analyze the delta between the case cart and the point of consumption, where we know things occur, like waste, putbacks, et cetera. It just happens, returns. So unimpeachable data is key. If you have some break in that data chain where any surgeon can say, well, wait a minute, how did you derive this? And you give an anecdotal answer, the forecast calls for pain. So again, it comes down to picking the right partner.
Thank you. Unimpeachable data is a great way to end. I'll kick it back to our hosts. Thank you so much, Jim, Lee, Todd. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And that is all the time we have for today. I want to thank the panelists for that excellent discussion and for sponsoring today's webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day, everyone. We look forward to having you join us for future webinars.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
Thank you, Lee. Thanks, Dan.